Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for your participation this afternoon. I'm Tim York. I'm the CEO of the California Leafy Greens Marketing Agreement, better known as the LGMA. The LGMA was formed in 2007, an industry-led food safety effort with oversight from federal and state regulators. We bring farmers together to make food safety safer. Together with our sister organization in Arizona, we cover over 90% of the lettuce and leafy greens consumed in the United States. Our intent today is to share information about Cyclospora more broadly and then be specific about the mitigation strategies that the LGMAs employ. And with that, let me introduce our speaker today, Dr. Jennifer McEntire. She's a food microbiologist. She previously worked with IFPA and United Fresh and was part of the 2019 Blue Ribbon panel convened by Fresh Express to address Cyclospora. She's the founder of consulting firm Food Safety Strategy. Dr. McEntire will walk us through her presentation, and then we will take questions via the chat. Dr. McEntire, thank you for being here on such short notice. We appreciate your flexibility. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. I want to thank the California and Arizona LGMAs for having me to talk about this topic, which has been the subject of so much discussion over the past couple of weeks, but really over the past several years. So I have a few slides that I'll go through and share. I would ask that people put questions in that Q&A box. Greg Komar from California LGMA will sort through. We should have plenty of time for questions at the end. So as you think of them, go ahead and stick them in the Q&A box, please. So the bottom line, I think when a crisis like this occurs and there are thousands of cases of illness, the question everyone is asking, understandably, is what do we do? And what can we do to make sure something like this doesn't happen again? What's next? What more do we need to do? And I think we need to pause and look at what we're already doing and question, is that enough? Is following the measures that we have in place today, is that adequate? And my assessment based on the current LGA metrics is that they largely do address cyclospora risks if they're followed, if they're implemented very well. This is based on what we know today, and there's an awful lot that we don't know. So what can be done then? To me, it's three things. Number one is vigilance. So making sure that we are following the steps that we know should be effective. Number two is verification, making sure that people are actually doing what they say they're doing. And that goes through the supply chain. Number three, there are a lot of opportunities to research here to better understand this organism, to see if perhaps there's something we've missed or there are additional mitigations that can be implemented. Let me go through why I think this. What we do know is that this is a people problem. Humans are the host. The issue is human fecal material, raw sewage. That's very clear. But there are a lot of things that we don't know, and a lot of challenges, peculiarities associated with this organism that make it much more difficult than our rank and file pathogenic E. coli, salmonella, listeria, etc. First is that the organism does not grow, and this presents numerous challenges. So temperature, usually we say keep cold things cold. There's the 40 to 140 is the danger zone for bacterial growth. That does not apply to Cyclospora. Cyclospora is not going to grow unless it's in the human, in the host. We don't have a whole lot of research. We don't have much to do research on in terms of Cyclospora having access to the organism because it doesn't grow. So for scientists, researchers in laboratories, in order to do research, you have to have this organism. But because we can't stick it in a test tube and create a culture of millions and billions of Cyclospora, we just don't have that much Cyclospora to do research on to answer a number of questions that we have, certainly that I have. So this inability to grow, it impacts our test methods, our research capabilities. There's a whole slew of things associated with the inability to grow. But I guess it's good that however much we have, that temperature abuse doesn't make things worse here. A really weird thing is that it's not immediately infectious. So it has a human host, it comes out in feces, but unlike many other pathogens, neurovirus, hepatitis A, the salmonellas, the pathogenic E. coli, this is not an issue where somebody was sick, they didn't wash their hands, and that next thing that they touch, if somebody else eats it, that they're going to become sick. It seems that this organism needs some time outside of the host in order to transition, to move through its life cycle and become infectious. This is not to say that hand washing is not important. Hand washing is still very important for all those other pathogens. But for Cyclospora, it's not clear that there's this direct fecal oral route associated with illness. Third thing, very disappointingly, discouragingly, is that the antimicrobials that we use effectively in water, whether it's agricultural water that we're going to be using for irrigation, whether it's processing water that we're using for washing, that the antimicrobials that we use in those water systems don't seem to impact Cyclospora to a large degree. So the water treatment that we're doing, again, that we shouldn't stop doing for other pathogens, for managing those issues, it's not going to work for Cyclospora. We know that it's quite resistant to chlorine, to PAA. There may be some other technologies that are out there, ozone, UV light, maybe chlorine dioxide, but a big barrier to better understanding if there are treatment methods is that we don't have the organism to work with. And so a lot of the research that's been done has been done on surrogate parasites, some that are, we think, kind of similar to Cyclospora, but it's not the actual organism. And so I have seen some claims on social media about, well, use my blend or use my treatment or use my technology that's effective against Cyclospora. And I'm very cautious about those claims because I don't know that they've been validated. I don't know how they could be validated when we don't have Cyclospora to test them against. The fourth thing is that illness is seasonal. Predictably, when it's associated with domestically acquired cases, so setting aside those who have traveled, we see an uptick in the late part of the spring. If you look at CDC's data dashboard, the BEAM dashboard, and look at outbreaks, they peak in June and they're pretty high in July. And as we get to August, we don't see a whole lot of outbreak counts, and illnesses absolutely start to taper off. This is a predictable pattern, and we don't really understand why this seems to be a summertime type of issue. And that's really important to keep in mind as we look at some of the studies on prevalence. And there are several challenges in trying to interpret these prevalence studies. The first is associated with methodology. I'll talk about testing later and why testing for this organism is much more complicated. I know many of you saw FDA's note just yesterday about the complexities in testing for Cyclospora. So I think we should be a little bit suspect of the prevalence data that we have seen, first questioning, are we actually picking up Cyclospora? But the other thing that's really stands out to me is that the pattern of what we believe to be detection based on the method is not at all a match with when we see cases of illness. And so this is some work that was funded by the Center for Produce Safety, which has funded a lot of the research on Cyclospora over the past couple of years. This was done by Dr. Inez Ortega, who really discovered this organism. And she looked at water in the Salinas River and also in Florida in canals. So we have blue is California, orange is Florida, and the highest prevalence was in December for California. You see the bar up there. And December, you don't really have cases of cyclospora. And even in the tailing months when production in the region is higher, it's not a match, this prevalence. And so I think we really need to be cautious about what we think we know when it comes to prevalence of cyclospora and the correlation with human illness. So preventing outbreaks is all about what? Here, for this organism, without question, there has to be a focus on prevention. This is a prevention-oriented strategy. That's what we've got right now. Prevention is key. So preventing introduction of contaminated fecal matter, whether it's through people, directly, through their hands, through their shoes, whether it is through sewage that's contaminated a water system that's being used directly, or that winds up being flood water. So preventing that introduction of contaminated fecal material is the top approach. And I think it's kind of the only approach, one of the only really effective approaches that we have right now. Testing is not a control. I've gotten many questions on testing product, testing water, the role that testing can play. And I will talk about that more in a few minutes, but I feel very strongly that that would be a misguided effort. There are extremely limited opportunities for remediation, for removal of the parasite once product has been contaminated, or really even maybe once water has been contaminated. So there are some filtration that may work. Sand, zero-valent iron has been explored, and the organism is physically larger than bacteria. So there is the possibility of just physical exclusion through filtration. What do you do with the backwash? I think that's been a reasonable question, because if you filter, basically, if there is the organism, you're concentrating it. So what do you now do with this concentrated organism? But maybe there can be some removal through that mechanism. I'm personally curious about whether there's an opportunity to stop it mid-life cycle, to slow or to arrest the sporulation process that results in it becoming infective and being able to harm people. So how are the metrics constructed today, and what are those preventative measures that already exist within the metrics? They fall into a couple of buckets. So first, there's already a requirement to assess fields for feces and to assess them for flooding. So looking for feces, looking for evidence of fecal contamination, of flooding of fields where there may have been sewage issues. There's a 30-foot setback requirement from homes that have septic leach fields, and there's a straight prohibition on biosolids use. So those elements are covered. When we look at water, there are requirements. There's been a lot of discussion about how do you assess your water? How do you test your water? What do you do to understand if a test is maybe something unusual, maybe a signal that something has occurred? There's a call out to consider when there are storms. These are all things that, to me, if implemented with Cyclospora, with human fecal material, with raw sewage in mind, these should be elements of a control strategy. There is the statement in the metrics that water systems that convey untreated human or animal waste are never suitable for use in leafy greens. So that should already be off the table. There are requirements, basic gap stuff, washing hands. As I mentioned, there's a timing issue here. When do hands need to be washed? And I would say that everybody should be washing their hands. So not just during harvest, but even earlier in a production cycle. Hand washing, making sure that we're being mindful of fecal contamination on hands. There is a requirement to exclude ill workers showing signs of diarrheal disease. That is what's associated with cyclosporiasis. And so being really vigilant, monitoring employees, workers, making sure that people who are sick aren't going to be around product again, not just during times of harvest, but even before and after, at all times. There are numerous requirements related to portable toilets. So the accessibility of toilets so that people are using toilet facilities and not defecating where it's just most convenient. The cleaning, maintenance of those toilet facilities, being mindful of the potential for spills, that they are being emptied regularly, that they are being maintained in a way that protects the product from any potential fecal contamination. That this is really an area of emphasis. And then general cleaning and sanitation. So even though the antimicrobials may not be effective against Cyclospora, just the physical removal, the process of cleaning, the process of sanitation could still help prevent cross-contamination if something is contaminated. So testing. A controversial topic. I know that testing often feels good. You feel like, oh, but I tested, and so things are okay. There are many reasons that testing has its limitations. We know a lot of them in terms of just straight statistics, but some of these challenges with testing are really exacerbated for Cyclospora because it won't grow. Today, when we're testing, say we test product and you test 25 grams of product, you know you're looking for a needle in a haystack. If an organism might be there, it might not be there. You test a larger amount, a larger mass, 375 grams, 1,500 grams, it increases your chance that something is there, right? And so normally the first step is an enrichment. So that if there's even one organism in, say, that 1,500 grams, you can grow it up, you have enough organism, you have enough of the genetic material in order to be able to test for it. But for Cyclospora, if you have one, you can do an enrichment, you're still going to have one. And so it's just a very limited amount of genetic material that you have, even as a starting point. Even if you can crack open this kind of hard-shelled organism and get that genetic material out. So there's several technical barriers to being able to effectively test. There are questions around if you get a positive, and what does a positive mean? Does it mean that you just happen to find some of this molecular material that triggered the test? Does it mean that there was an organism there, but we don't know if it's alive or dead? Even if it's alive, is it infectious or not? What stage in its life cycle is it? So there are a number of challenges with testing, and this is not your normal, typical standard test. So this is a test that not every laboratory can do correctly, can do in a timely or cost-effective manner. So there are numerous issues associated with testing, and we see if FDA has trouble, if FDA is talking about the complexity of the test, how can we look to industry members with any expectation of a reasonable amount of reliability? So what we don't know is a lot. We don't know why it's seasonal. We don't know what triggers this sporulation, this transition to infectivity. And so, we say, and studies have shown that it takes a week or 2 weeks outside of the host under certain, conditions of temperature, perhaps humidity. But have we looked at all of the different levers? Have we looked at fluctuations, cycling of temperature? Have we looked at different types of moisture? Have we looked at the effect of modified atmosphere? Have we looked at the effect of these antimicrobials that may not kill the organism? Do they spur it to infectivity? So there's a ton that we don't know about this, about the life cycle and how it evolves from one stage, not infectious, to a stage where it is infectious. We know that humans are the only host, or at least we think we know that humans are the only host. Yes, there are some studies that show that if you feed it Cyclospora to animals, it'll come out the other end, but without replication. So maybe they can carry it, but I I'm not sure that that's our top concern at the current moment. I think we really need to focus on people. And so if people are the only host, and we know that we hear explosive diarrhea, we can see symptomatic people, but are there people who are just carrying this organism that maybe were exposed, maybe even sick as a child, and now they have the parasite in them? And may there be episodic times when they are shedding the organism? This is something I'm not sure we know a whole lot about, or at least enough about. And we also don't really know the possibilities for persistence in the environment. So we say that week or two. Well, so if there's a flood, for how long do we need to be concerned if there was the inadvertent presence of raw sewage on a field that you want to plant in? How long do we have to wait before Cyclospora goes away? I'm not sure we really know the answer to that. There are some resources out there. There are numerous resources, and especially now, I'm glad to see that many of the organizations are putting some information out there. But there are a few key resources that I want to draw your attention to. One is just about 6-7 months ago, Callie Neal at the University of Delaware published a review in Comprehensive Reviews in Food Science and Food Safety on Cyclospora and some of the related organisms, the surrogates. So looking at the totality of research, the body of knowledge around this organism, that's one of the more current reviews. A couple of years ago, NACMF, in its last years of life, FDA charged this advisory committee with explaining Cyclospora and had a number of questions that they charged the committee with. Although that report was not officially published, like in a peer-reviewed journal, the draft report is still available. You can still find it. And I think that it is a really well done, really comprehensive evaluation, especially when it gets to some of the limitations of test methods. And as the test methods have changed over time, how that changes our perception of positivity. Recognizing that now that many of these positives may have been false positives. But I go back even further to 2019. I was part of the Fresh Express Blue Ribbon panel looking at Cyclospora. What do we know? What do we not know? What do we need to find out? And it's kind of discouraging to see how little has changed. And so there were a couple of categories. It's not a super long report, maybe 20-ish pages, if I remember correctly, but there were a couple of topical areas and subgroups, work groups that formed on collaboration, on test methods and detection, on mitigations, on root cause analysis. And to see that we're still struggling with many of the same issues and many of the same questions today as we were back then. So who are the researchers? You know, if we were talking about another pathogen, we wouldn't even have a slide like this because the list would be so long. But there's a pretty limited number of people who have firsthand experience with this organism. FDA does a lot of the research themselves, especially on the methodology. You may hear reference now to FDA BAM method 19C that was preceded by 19B, 19A, with different limitations that FDA has sought to overcome in improving this method. CDC also does work, often in collaboration with FDA, on methodology and on typing. There have been questions about, is this one enormous outbreak? Are there multiple outbreaks? Why can't we tell? And we don't have the tools to distinguish one cyclospora, one cluster, one outbreak from another, the same way that we do for bacteria. And CDC has really led the way in along with FDA, trying to develop these scientific methods. Some of the expert parasitologists are based not too far from me in Maryland at USDA's Ag Research Service in Beltsville. This is a laboratory that is scheduled to close. The scientists are supposed to be relocated. I have no idea if they will choose to relocate or not, but to me, this is really going to be detrimental as we seek to better understand the organism. If these researchers are not available, no longer doing the work on Cyclospora when we need them to be. Their work has been primarily on concentration of the organism. So how do we collect enough of it, and how do we detect it? So looking at some other means of detection, especially when it comes to that viability and infectivity. Center for Produce Safety has funded a little bit of this work and has some reports available on their website. And then in academia, it's relatively few. So I mentioned Inez Ortega at the University of Georgia already, foundational work. She's done a lot of what we think we know came from Dr. Ortega and her early work. She continues to work in this area. Dr. Callie Neal at the University of Delaware, my alma mater, also is a parasitologist, understands protozoa like Cyclospora, has done work, including the zero valent iron work that I mentioned. There are a couple of others who have been funded by Center for Produce Safety or others on, doing varying degrees of work, but it's really difficult to work on Cyclospora when you don't have Cyclospora. I can't say that enough. So there's a lot more that we don't know. And to me, root cause analysis, really when there's an outbreak, that helps us understand what we don't know. Because when an outbreak occurs, it really, in my opinion, can only be because of one of three things. It is either a known issue, but the people didn't know, in which case the remedy there is awareness, outreach, education, training, so that the people who are doing the thing know what they should be doing. Because the scientific community, the practices are known, just these people didn't know. The rules and metrics may be in place. They don't need adjustment, they need to be implemented. Another is that, again, the issues were known, but the system, for whatever reason, failed. And the remedy there is, maybe it's the process, maybe it's technology, maybe it's time, that people didn't have enough time to do the work that needed really to be done. Maybe it's financial or other resources. Again, what we should have been doing was known within the world of the universe or the universe of the world. But it just wasn't done because of failure in the system, a failure in the process. And again, the rules, metrics, they may be in place, but they just weren't being executed the way they should have been. It's only this third possibility where I think additional research and then changes to practices are warranted. And that's when we, through root cause analysis, discover something new, something that we didn't know before. And then we have to do some work and figure things out. And once we figure things out, then it's appropriate to make an adjustment to the rules, to the metrics, to recommendations, to industry practices. So my call to action, there are 4 things that I think need to be done right away. First is for growers, and that is adherence to the metrics, especially with Cyclospora in mind. So it's metrics, and produce safety rule obviously is a regulation that has to be followed. But thinking about Cyclospora and thinking about the metrics and the requirements and really internalizing them and adopting them, not just carrying them out on paper and satisfying the checklist, but really thinking about your growing environment, your conditions, what the metrics say, what you have to do, but thinking about how they really apply to this issue of raw sewage and human fecal contamination. The second is on the buyers, and that's verification. For California, Arizona, there are the LGMAs. Are there other questions that should be asked that get kind of specific? As we look at sourcing from other regions, especially if we look at imported products, there's the Foreign Supplier Verification Program. If you're a buyer subject to Foreign Supplier Verification Program, in my experience, most buyers say, oh, give me your third-party audit. Okay, I've satisfied FSVP. Is there a better way to verify that controls are in place through the supply chain that are focused on prevention? The third thing, and there's some time sensitivity around this. It just so happens that right now the Center for Produce Safety is looking for areas to put out in their request for proposals. And so now through July 31st, they are soliciting ideas and they've put out a broad call. Anybody can offer their suggestion to CPS of, hey, I think this would be a good research project. I think this is a topic that CPS should go out to the research community and ask for proposals. I feel it would be a really missed opportunity if the industry, buyers and growers, didn't take advantage of this time to come together and to align on what are the key questions related to Cyclospora that have to be answered that CPS could help fund. So submit them to CPS. For full disclosure, I'll be part of the team helping to write the request for proposals, but that doesn't mean I get to just put down on paper what I want done. CPS wants to hear from everyone on what those priorities are, not just for Cyclospora, but if you have other produce safety priorities, it's all fair game. But I think given the crisis that we face right now, it would be prudent to align on Cyclospora research priorities. And then fourth is learning from that root cause analysis. And again, we have a timeliness issue with CPS. Ideally, we do the root cause analysis first. We'd see where we need more investment. But I think I expect that's going to take just a little bit more time. But we can't lose those lessons. And so my hope is that anything that's uncovered from the outbreaks that have occurred historically, that are occurring this year, that may be occurring right now, that we do learn from these things and identify opportunities for more education, for better implementation, and perhaps for research. So with that, as promised, we've got plenty of time for questions. I've seen some things coming through the chat. So Tim, I will turn it back to you and your team for a discussion.
Great. Thank you, Dr. McEntire. Invite my colleagues Greg Komar from California LGMA and Cami Van Horn from Arizona LGMA to join us at this time. The question was asked in the chat, and want to be sure we covered that this presentation has been being recorded. It'll be on a link up on our website. If it's not on the front page, you'll find it in a drop-down box under technical resources. Dr. McEntire, let me start with asking you about what occurred over the weekend. Obviously, extremely disruptive and expensive for the entire supply chain for buyers and the growers and shippers alike. How does a mistake like that happen, and can we expect that is another possibility the next time they say there's a positive?
Tim, I think we are all asking this question, right? How could a mistake like this happen? You have to have confidence. We as the industry have to have confidence when we hear something from FDA that information is reliable and that we should take action upon it. And so to have FDA come out in hindsight prematurely before they were able to confirm the result of this test it just creates an enormous amount of chaos. If I try to put myself in their shoes, and I'm not at all making an excuse for this, but they've got to be under intense pressure to do something, right? So the epidemiology was done, the traceback was done, they identified a source, they are stopping product at the border, testing it. These all seem like appropriate things to do, and I can imagine that when they got that initial positive, that they probably got really excited that they had found the smoking gun. And to have come out with a public statement on this before it was confirmed is catastrophic. And I have to imagine that they are looking internally at how they're going to do things in the future so that something like this does not happen again. But I think what it really confirms for me is that there are serious challenges with this test method. And so if FDA has trouble with the test method, When they're doing targeted testing and they are the ones who developed this method, well, how are the rest of us supposed to be able to use and trust the results of this type of test? I will say, though, I don't think that, as I suggested in my talk, testing is not the be all end all. And so a positive, a confirmed positive tells you a lot. A negative doesn't mean that it's all clear. And so I think we need to be realistic about what testing, even under the best of circumstances, reliable circumstances, what testing tells us and what testing doesn't tell us.
And if I can ask a follow-up question, then should we be encouraged or discouraged by what you've shared today? I guess there's a little bit of both in there, maybe. Discouraged because it's so difficult to detect and treat, but encouraged that if our processes are followed well, that we have a very good chance of mitigating this and not getting it into our products.
I think that's fair. I am very discouraged at the lack of research progress in this area, at the fact that we're still, very early in our understanding of this organism. That is very discouraging to me. It's discouraging that we don't have fantastic backup plans for Cyclospora, those mitigations that can be implemented, like chemical treatment, robust physical removal, great detection methods. Those things are discouraging, but because we do know that this is a people issue, that it's about preventing the introduction of fecal material, that gives us a lot of tools on the prevention side that the metrics do cover. And so I think that we need to be extremely attentive to those, especially during what we consider cyclospora season. Be very mindful of those, be attentive to those, be very strict in our adherence during at all times, but especially during those times or times of heightened risk. But it is encouraging that it's not like we're missing something here in the metrics.
Thank you. Greg, I'll turn it over to you. And just for our audience, you can use either the chat or the Q&A under the more with the little three dots at the bottom. That's the Q&A is there. Use that or the chat if you've got additional questions. Greg?
Great. So thank you, Jennifer. This has been fantastic. And there's quite a few questions coming through at the moment. I want to kind of continue with Tim's earlier question about, how did this happen? What maybe happened with the method? And it's kind of more of a method question, which is one, it's kind of in the weeds here, but I thought you might know a little bit more about this than others. What type of matrices can 19C be used with confidence? Do you know if they're all kind of similar, or, and matrices, I mean water, soil, product, those types of things?
I would have to look because 19C is a newer method. So 19B was around for a bit. 19C is just within the past couple of years that FDA has moved to 19C. I can take a look, but you can also look in the FDA BAM, the Bacterial Analytical Manual is where FDA states how to perform the method and the matrices that it's been validated against, which is not everything. I feel very comfortable saying it's not every single produce item. It's not every single possible matrix, but I suspect, and I'm sure that there are some people on the line who know the answer to this definitively, that it's the food, that it's probably water. And then it's also the food products that FDA has a history of outbreaks as being association. So there are some of the herbs, leafy greens, berries is my suspicion, but I would have to check to know which matrices it's been validated against.
Okay, no, fair enough. We can definitely research that. Going back to, you were talking about implementation, and the list of folks that are helping us with this. So you mentioned, the researchers, and there's some organizations out in the world that are doing research in this area and developing methods. But from a training and other resources perspective, obviously we have some organizations in the United States that are working on Cyclospora outreach. But do you know of any outside of the U.S. that may have been really focused on, I'm thinking obviously some of the regions that we know of that are potentially suspect when it comes to Cyclospora. Do you know of any other areas or again, other organizations or even governments that maybe have a little bit more a better hold on this than maybe we do at the moment?
So I'm not sure I can say that there are other parts of the world that understand Cyclospora better than we do here in the United States. Certainly, there are other parts of the world that have a lot of experience with illnesses, with outbreaks. They don't always have the same, they often don't have the same detection systems and surveillance systems that we have here. They don't always have the same resources in terms of laboratory capabilities, trained scientists. And so there are people, certainly in other parts of the world, who work on Cyclospora. I've seen papers looking at in China, in Italy, in many parts of the world. But I don't know of a global effort, and that's not to say one doesn't exist, but I don't know of a global effort to bring all of these worldwide experts together to share knowledge. But I think it's relative to other organisms, it's a pretty limited pool, so it's something that should be considered. And Greg, I want to note that I saw in the chat something I meant to mention and forgot to mention, which is at the International Association for Food Protection meeting next week in New Orleans, that on that Sunday when the professional development groups get together, one of them is the pre-harvest professional development group, and they've gotten Dr. Inez Ortega to come and give a Cyclospora 101. And again, she's a wealth of information. So for those going to IAFP, that's a great opportunity. And just coincidentally, there are a number of sessions at IAFP on Cyclospora. I'm sure that they will be packed.
It will be, yes. Kind of similar to that question about resources outside of the United States. Now let's go to actually the regulatory side. So you mentioned FSVP and the third party audits as being potentially, is that enough? But what are international suppliers required to do? Like, is there an LGMA or a FSMA or a put in the standard name that they have to adhere to in order to, consider them be certified, if you will, as being a food safe operator?
So the requirements on paper is that for, say, fresh produce that is going to be consumed in the United States, it's imported into the US, that those growers do follow the produce safety rule. So the same produce safety rule that domestic growers need to follow. The question, I think, comes down to awareness, implementation, and verification. In the United States, from a regulatory standpoint, it is primarily the states who are going out doing these inspections to make sure that growers are following the produce safety rule. And as you can imagine, FDA just does not have the resources to deploy their inspectors all around the world to do produce safety rule inspections. So on paper, they should be following produce safety rule. In reality, we don't have a great way of checking that. And that's why the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, why that rule exists, because it puts the onus on the importer to check that. But as I mentioned, I think the way that that rule has been interpreted by the industry is not fantastic. I don't think that that rule is in actuality as effective as it could be if people implemented it in a way that it was intended to meet the intent of verifying that their suppliers are in fact meeting those food safety requirements.
Right.
And they may need to meet the requirements in their own country, adhere to their state, federal, their local or federal regulations. But there may be, I'm not sure about for leafy greens, but for some other food products, there are sort of industry groups in country that also hold their members accountable. But I don't know of anything that's really at the scale of the LGMAs.
Okay. No, thank you. Let's now get into some more theoretical questions here. So we're going to lean on your expertise, and you've been around a little bit and understand how our industry works. And I guess let's tackle seasonality real fast. Like, any ideas in your mind about why this potentially is happening? Like, what is it about seasonality? Like, one of the questions asked is just the complexity of our supply chain, maybe kind of adding to some of these issues with seasonality, so certain products come into the country at certain times of the year versus others or whatnot. I don't know. It's a theoretical question, but wanted to get your kind of gist on that one.
Yeah, it really bothers me because I don't know. And yes, we know that there's seasonality to products in growing regions, but it seems to me that when we look at all the different types of foods that are imported at different times of the year, that I would expect things to be leveled out a little bit more than than they are. And so I'm not convinced that this is a correlation with certain products and with supply chains as much as something else that we just don't understand right now.
Right. Okay. Let's get into sanitation a little bit. One of the questions is a very practical question, right? If a operator, whether that's, think of harvest equipment or a production line, gets contaminated with Cyclospora, how would you decontaminate those pieces of equipment?
I think we're talking about physical removal. So we shouldn't count on, chemicals disinfecting Cyclospora, but let's look to, wash things away so that the detergents, the scrubbing, um, aiming for that physical removal and doing it in a place where whatever's rinsing off is unlikely to then contact produce that you are going to want to harvest.
I read an article, and I can't remember where it was from. I want to say it was either a state or a federal post that said something to the extent that washing Cyclospora kills it. And I think we can say that that's not the case, but I just wanted to kind of pick your brain again about that one. Does soap or detergents, would they maybe, do something to the wall or, somehow destroy that organism?
So this may be a little bit of an extrapolation, but when scientists have been researching how can we access the inside of Cyclospora so that we can get at its genetic material, one of the things that seems to be effective is for those of you who've been in microbiology labs who've used something called tween. So it is like a surfactant, a detergent. So it seems that this can, maybe disrupt that outer layer of Cyclospora. So it's possible that some of these detergents could help, although I don't know the duration, the concentrations. I mean, there will be a lot of work to be done before saying affirmatively that yes, detergents will destroy Cyclospora. But as we're looking at the detection methods, there are some similarities just in terms of like the chemistry, the structure, that it's something worth pursuing.
Excellent. Sticking on that disruption kind of thought, now let's go to some like physical processes, kill steps, things like that. So composting, we know some of the other inputs that go into agricultural purposes. What do you know about composting? Can the process of composting, a complete composting cycle, potentially disrupt Cyclospora?
So we know that cooking kills Cyclospora. So it's that 160-ish degrees, maybe it's 158 degrees for however many seconds that can kill Cyclospora. And composting is, kind of a form of cooking, right? So if you're generating heat, you're generating enough heat, that level of heat for an appropriate duration, I would count that as similar. I would think of that similarly to cooking. It's a thermal process. That's what we're looking for in order to kill the organism.
Okay, excellent. And then similarly, then chicken pellets and those other types of inputs go through very intense thermal processes. So likely that would also solve that issue. There's a lot of great questions. They're not all kind of, kind of together, so I'm trying to pick ones that maybe are the more interest to others. So you mentioned earlier, this is a really important question. I think you've answered it potentially, but there aren't that many oocysts to do research on, right? But this is a pretty darn big outbreak or multiple outbreaks that we're dealing with. Could we harvest this outbreak, the patient samples for potential future oocysts?
That's a great question, and it's something that I've thought about. Some of the discussions that I've had, I or others have made this point that never have we had an opportunity to harvest this many oocysts, this much Cyclospora. There can be some issues with, HIPAA laws and people giving permission, and also just the resources, like who wants to actually do this work of collecting all this material and sorting through it, right? Especially when we have so many people who are sick. But this is if there's a silver lining, perhaps it is that we now have an opportunity to collect Cyclospora. I hope the time has not passed. I hope that when people began getting ill, that this was already on the radar of public health officials seeing these patients and having the foresight to start collecting fecal material so that we can use this Cyclospora. One of the projects that was mentioned at CPS just last month by Dr. Lenaham at University of Tennessee, he had actual Cyclospora to work with, and he got it through a collaboration with his health department. And so, the state by state relationships, who would have access to the Cyclospora, I think the devil's in the details, but I really hope that somebody is collecting this stuff so we have more of the organism.
We did get a message in the Q&A. Someone looked up the BAM methods, and it looks like 19C is a real-time PCR for the detection of Cyclospora in ag water. So
it is, as I mentioned, a newer method. If water is what they started with, that would be a logical starting point. But I hope that they do some work to expand it to other matrices. But it may be part of the issue in looking at a tissue sample, a product sample, why it becomes a little bit more difficult if the method's not been validated and fully vetted.
Right. Let me see here. Quite a few. Just let me kind of go through the questions here real fast, Jennifer. One of the, I think this is obviously on everyone's mind is because of the size of this one, geographic stance of it. Does it kind of point to a larger environmental contamination potentially, as opposed to a point source specific product, for instance?
When we look at the illnesses throughout the United States and the distribution throughout the United States, the numbers, and especially the number in Michigan today that they posted was almost 6,150 people. We've never seen numbers like that. And so that's definitely a signal that something is going on in Michigan. But when we look more broadly at the United States, I feel pretty confident saying this is not one outbreak. There are probably multiple things going on from multiple different sources, different causes. And so I don't think we can look at all of these cases in the country and say there's one mega environmental contamination. I do think it warrants looking at some of these hotspots and understanding what's contributing to these astronomically high numbers. Because this is not, when you have 6,100 people in a state confirmed ill, this is not one person who didn't wash their hands. This is something much bigger. And that can help, hone in on like the rule in, rule out, what's more likely, what's less likely when we have something of this magnitude.
With just a few minutes left, because I know Tim does want to do some closing remarks. Just a kind of a high level, Jennifer. You've pointed out a lot of things that you think you would suggest moving forward, but I want to kind of ask you about research, and if there's like one or two specific things that you think would really move the needle from a research perspective, what do you think those are?
When I was at the CPS meeting last month and we got the survey at the end and it said, if you have any ideas for the RFP, like what are your research ideas? Before any of this happened, the research idea that I submitted, one of them was related to Cyclospora. And the thing that's on my mind is how do we disrupt its life cycle? So are there things that can interrupt the life cycle? Or are there things that accelerate the life cycle, which would be really useful to know if we're doing things that result in, in a quicker, a more rapid transition into the infectious form. And so this is the area where I would like to see more research, because I think if we focus our efforts on detection, it's just way too messy distinguishing live from dead, infectious from not. I think if we have and testing, it's kind of reactive. Like at the point that you find it, it's there. I want to do something more proactive in stopping people from getting sick. And I think looking at this life cycle, to me, that's where I would like to see more research.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Jennifer. This has been fantastic. I'm going to now turn it over to Tim for some closing remarks.
Yeah.
And thanks all the participants for joining us today.
I do the same. So thanks everybody for showing up today. Thank you, Dr. McEntire, for again being so Johnny on the spot here and helping us address this very current issue. So thank you. People can find you by Googling Jennifer McEntire at Food Safety Strategy.
I feel like at this point, everyone has found me every which way. So yes, I am very accessible. I am very accessible. I'm on LinkedIn and I certainly welcome the connections.
There's no such thing as anonymity in your world, it sounds like. So, well, thank you, everyone. Best afternoon to you. And again, thank you, Jennifer.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.